Check.
Don't chase me, Chief. You Comanche? Lords of the Plains?
Lords of nothing now. I call.
Show your cards, gentlemen.
Do you know what Comanche means? It means enemies forever.
Enemies with who?
Everyone.
You know what that makes me?
An enemy.
No. It makes me a Comanche.
One and all, behoove and behold. I'm Nick Muniz, this is Nick's Nonfiction. Today on the show we have got S.C. Gwynne's Empire of the Summer Moon. Why do Native Americans hate when white people ask to use their Wi-Fi? Because we take up all their land. The New York Times says, this stunning historical account of the 40-year battle between Comanche Indians and white settlers for control of the American West is nothing short of a revelation. It will leave dust and blood in your jeans. Can I get a yee-haw? Yee-haw! Although readers may be more familiar with the tribal names Apache and Sioux, it was in fact the legendary fighting ability of the Comanches that determined when the American West opened up. Comanche boys became adept bareback riders by age 6. Full Comanche braves were considered the best horsemen who ever rode. They were so masterful at war and so skillful with their arrows and lances that they stopped the northern drive of colonial Spain from Mexico and halted the French expansion towards Louisiana. How do Native Americans celebrate Columbus Day? They walk into your house and say, I live here now. The war with the Comanches lasted 4 decades, in effect holding up the development of the American nation. We can't be having that manifest destiny. It's my God-given right to poison you natives with smallpox. A cowboy thought he had 100 cows, but when he counted them up, there were only 97. So he rounded up. Cowboys don't roll joints. They tumble weed. My knickers, we'll be right back. About the author S.C. Gwynne. Samuel C. Gwynne III is an American writer. He holds a bachelor degree in history from Princeton University and a master's in writing from Johns Hopkins. How do you get in this publishing industry? He worked for Time magazine as a correspondent, bureau chief, and senior editor. He was later an executive editor at Texas Monthly. His journalism has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, Los Angeles Times, Outside Magazine's, Dallas Morning News. Yeah, he's written for everybody. That's how you get a #1 bestseller. The Wall Street Journal, it's read by people who run the country. The Washington Post, it's read by people who think they run the country. The New York Times, it's read by people who think they should run the country, but are really just good at crossword puzzles. New York Times, you've been dadded. We'll be right back. Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynne, Chapter 1, Comanche Nation. Throwing in a dip-a-long cut like a cowboy. Let's round them up. It was the fall of 1871, and the United States Army drew closer to finally defeating the once mighty Comanche Nation. On the 3rd of October, 1871, the 4th Cavalry, under the command of Randall Siddell Mackenzie, was on the precipice of enacting the final solution. to the Western American struggle against the Comanches under the leadership of the Quanah Parker. So the story loops back to 1871, October 2nd. But yeah, they're calling it the final solution. I'm not taking sides today. It's basically the movie Avatar. Randall Mackenzie is Colonel Quaritch on Pandora. The storied history of violence was at its peak in 1871. Colonel Mackenzie, accompanied by General Tecumseh Sherman, yeah, I'd like to come on you, Shirley. Tecumseh Sherman remarked at how desolate the Texan frontier was of settlers compared to even a decade earlier. Settlers left in drove, escaping brutal Comanche raiding parties. Comanche success occurred amid the Industrial Revolution at a time of great social change in post-Civil War United States. So the book said the extermination of the buffalo was the greatest destruction of warm-blooded animals in the history of humanity. So if you want to beat the Comanche, you got to kill off all their food. Mackenzie and his troops sought out a specific group of Comanches on October 2nd, 1871, Cohaties, the group for which the war chief Quanah Parker came. Mackenzie made a mistake on that fateful day. Quanah and his warriors possessed superior information about the whereabouts of their enemies, and a raid on the night of the 3rd found the American soldiers ambushed, losing not only a few men but many horses. The battle later became known as the Battle of Blanco Canyon. It was the first of many battles over the following 4 years. Quanah Parker quickly became a renowned and hunted enemy. No less than 46 companies of American infantry and cavalry were in pursuit. Quanah's mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, was a daughter of the influential Parker clan, a family built on veritable fortresses on the very edge of the Texan frontier within the area known as Comancheria. The Parker clan. That's what I need, a powerful clan. All my clan does is go to the woods and wear bed sheets. The Ku Klux, get it? It all began in 1833 when the Parker family migrated from Illinois to Texas with the promise of free land and hopes that such a promise would be bought with it. You get the whole backstory here. The Parker clan, they have 16,000 acres. In 1836, they get their fort set up, and then the Comanches start with the raids. At the time of the Parker raid, the Parker fort represented the outermost expansion of the American frontier, and the Parkers, like most Americans, did not fully understand or comprehend who the Comanches were. The two sides, the Americans and the Comanches, shared more in common than they were willing to admit. What they share in common is what you saw in the intro video. Enemy to all. The Comanche lands extended over large parts of present-day Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. While it is referred to as the Comanche Nation, the Comanches did not work or operate in any sort of political, military, or economic cohesion the way that European nations did. Though they engaged in trade with other Indian tribes, Mexican and Americans, they often utilized Comancheros as mediators. A Shoshone dialect served as the lingua franca of the Southern Plains Indians, much like Latin did during the Roman Empire. Because of these differences in culture, the Europeans and Americans gravely underestimated the Comanches. They don't even have a unified language. They could never stand up to us. They were basically the Anasazi Empire round 2. The tribes east of the Mississippi did not use the horses in war, and so it wasn't until settlers began encountering the Plains tribes that the image of the mounted Native American warrior took shape. Thus, the Comanches resembled other mounted archers, such as Genghis Khan and his Mongols, more than they did Indian tribes like the Iroquois. And it's only getting started. Chapter 2, Mexican Standoff. 6 days into Rachel's kidnapping, Rachel's Aunt Elizabeth was given to a band of Kiowa Indians who were on friendlier terms with the Comanches. Cynthia Ann and her brother John went with one husband of the Comanche, while Rachel and her son James went with another. However, as soon as the Comanches learned that Rachel had breastfed James, they removed him from her. She never saw him again. This act was simple. The Comanche always divided the spoils of their raids among themselves as equitably as possible, and captives were just part of the bounty to be divvied up, just like furs and horses. And so all these chicks, Cynthia Ann and Rachel and Elizabeth, they're all part of the Parker clan. Only one of them will be relevant later. The Comanche economy was solely interested in 3 things: horses, buffalo hides, and captives. The Comanches were a polygamous people, let's go, mainly because it was the woman who preferred all the labor in producing hides. They do all the work, and they take all the loads. Comanche male with many wives could obtain more hides. If they didn't have many wives, a Comanche male could have had slaves. Therefore, Rachel became exactly that. polygamy, the Mormons could have gotten along. So yeah, Rachel, she was pregnant when she was captured, and as soon as she gave birth to the full white son, they tied it to a horse and dragged it around till it died. Another captive, Herman Lehman, told a tale of violence. He was talking about the Comanches came across a band of Tonkawa. The Tonkawa were cannibals, and they had roasted a few of the Comanche tribe members. So the Comanche tracked down the Tonkawa and then mercilessly tortured them, then discarded the bodies without eating them. If you eat one of us, we torture you and then desecrate your body. The idea of the Great Spirit didn't actually exist among the Comanches. They weren't concerned with a creation myth. A Comanche named Post Oak Tim said, "We knew just where we were. Our thoughts were mostly directed toward understanding the spirits. There was no good or evil for them, yet the Comanches were also loving husbands and fathers. Thus their moral code manifested in ways inscrutable to the Anglos." So they believe in spirits, but not gods. The Comanche Nation consisted of a loose confederation of 5 major bands: Yampira, the Yap Eaters, which is yam; Cascada, the Buffalo Eaters; Panateka, the Honey Eaters; Nakoni, the Wanderers; and the Quahatis, the Antelope Eaters. There was no heredity in leadership. Leadership was instead based solely on merit. Comanche warriors first came across the white man in 1706 when they raided the lands of Spanish New Mexico. The Spanish conquistador style of colonialism, which had been so successful in Central and South America, did not work against the roaming tribes of the plains because of trusty-dusty guerrilla warfare. Like the Comanche and the Apache, these two hated each other since the beginning of time. But once the conquistadors came up south, the Apaches would let the Comanches hide within their tribe and then surprise attack the Spanish. So even how big a Comanche or an Apache, a lefty or a righty, as long as there's a bigger enemy, you could always get along. By 1750, the Spanish recognized that the Comanches were no friendlier than the French and the English than they were with them, and the Comancheria was a natural barrier that separated Spanish ambitions from that of European rivals. So by 1750, the Texans were like, yo, these people aren't being any nicer to us than they were the French or the Spanish. You're our enemy. So these borders hold up for 100 years, 1750 to 1838. In 1838, the new Republic of Texas elected a president named Mirabeau Bonaparte Lamar, a poet, a truculent Indian annihilator, and would-be empire builder. Lamar was in staunch opposition to the vaunted Sam Houston, who desired peace with Comanches. By the end of July 1839, the cornfields and villages of all the Cherokees, Delawares, Shawnees, Caddoans, Kickapoos, Creek Muskogees, and Seminoles in the East Texas were burned to the ground. During one incident in 1840, the Comanche came to San Antonio to walk with the Texans about ending their increasing encroachment on Comanche lands. The Texans refused to talk with the Comanches unless they released all captives. So that's a good move by the Texans. The Comanches can't speak for every single Comanche tribe. So they were trying to get peace, but you can't guarantee peace. But the Texans, they want vengeance more than equality. Many of the Comanches were then taken prisoners, the ones who came to negotiate. Only a few escaped from San Antonio. The Texans sent a woman to other Comanches with an ultimatum that if all white captives were not released, then they would kill the Comanche captives. The Comanches were at first devastated, then angry, and then butchered 13 of their captives. What became known as the Council House Fight was then the first sign that neither the Comanche nor the Texans would make any compromises. Texans. So they could have deliberated. They asked them to go to a walk together, and it turns into a Mexican hostage standoff. The Comanches were the first one to go, no, we don't take prisoners. The Panteka were defeating themselves, but wanted to take the Texans with them. A Panteka chief named Buffalo Hump had a vision wherein the Texans would be driven into the sea. He began to spread word of his vision. Warriors assembled over the following months. However, many of the other bands of Comanches only sent a handful of warriors. In August, a company of Pantekas and Kiowas rode south 1,000 strong. The most destructive raid was the Great Linville Raid. So thoroughly did they attack, kill, and plague, setting fire to buildings, that once thriving trade town was destroyed and never rebuilt. After the Linville raid, the Comanches returned to the lands while vengeful Texans pursued. The Texans who rode after Buffalo Hump and his warriors were a new breed of Texans, young men from back east who were fearless and highly adventurous. They were highly motivated to track Indians and kill them, and happily did it without pay or reward. Oh shit. The honky-ass white boys who like to do nothing other than kill, they're enlisting. Uh-oh. The Battle of Plum Creek was when the tides turned. General John Moore, he snuck up on Buffalo Hump, slit a bunch of the Indians' throats in the night. The Comanches are like, okay, they can go on the offensive. The author, he tries to drum up more sympathy for the Comanche. Life was harsh. Infertility and high death rates among men made maintaining population difficult. So that's one of the reasons they took the captives. It's all about numbers to the Native Americans. And they're going, we don't release captives. Once your people come to us, they don't re-assimilate. And you'll see that comes up later. Matilda Lockhart, she represented the slave captives. Cynthia Ann, she was representing the ones who were accepted into the tribe. So they kill the ones who are still not fully assimilated. Bianca Bagg was taken captive in 1866. Her written chronicle remains the only first-person narrative of girls captive, so we only have one account of a native girl ever taken by the captives. We're staying in story mode today. Bianca reported that life among the Comanches was very good. Every day seemed to be a holiday. She learned the Comanche language so well that it was difficult for her to relearn English. However good life was in general, food became problematic. The Comanche ate a lot of dried meat. When that was consumed, they didn't have any fresh or dried meat. They would eat boiled corn until that was exhausted. There was a pretty good scene here where a Texan went to barter for Cynthia Ann. He was like, I'll give you $500 for Cynthia Ann from the Parker clan. No, I'll give you $1,000. You could build a summer home. And the Indians are like, what the fuck are we going to do with money? This is all about numbers to us. In the 1850s, there were some Indians who got wise, and so they would start capturing women and then just sell them back to the white people and then buy goods with the rewards. So that's like the Panteca cultural death, how they got assimilated to the Mexican goods, the guns, and so then they weren't able to survive. And just like they killed off the buffalo, you're never going to beat them head on head. You can't beat guerrilla warfare with an army. You have to subvert it some other way. Much like the Vikings in Europe, their desire for war and loot led them to make decisions that inevitably crossed cultural exchanges. It was bound to happen, especially under such violent circumstances. But that's cultural appropriation! Cross-cultural appropriation is natural, but when there's a genocidal government willing to do anything, including exterminating buffaloes, you gotta team up. Chaotic evil beats chaotic good unless it's more organized. Chapter 3, Family Business. The Rangers were a new type of white man. They were dirty, ill-clad, aggressive, and fearless. They enjoyed killing Indians. However, they were almost always outmanned. Battles followed a typical pattern. The white man took cover, the Indians charged, men on both sides died, and the Indians finally withdrew, unwilling to take the losses it would require to pry the white man with firing Kentucky rifles. The Rangers, under the leadership and guidance of John Jack Coffee Hayes, became a very rough bunch of men. They trained hard and began fighting on horseback. They recognized it as a necessity to fight the Comanches using the same tactics the Comanches used against them. So the Rangers are mounting up. You're going to have to fight the Camaros by becoming a Camaro. 1860s come around, and what's that? The Civil War. The Comanches finally have time to catch their breath. Cynthia Ann, her husband, finally comes to negotiate for her. Peta Nakona's brutal sweep through the northern Texas was thus a political act with political objectives. So Cynthia Ann, her native husband, was Peta Nakona. And he's like, no, we got to kick them when they're down. Sure, there's a truce because they're at war. Well, you guys are at war with us. Did you forget about that? And all the other natives are like, maybe they'll change their mind because they're in a civil war. But yeah, it's too political to attack during a time of war, but you're allowed to endanger an entire food supply. There's no rules in war, but the natives are kind of laying off. The army units that replaced the Rangers were equally inept at combating Comanches. It was all about tactics. The idea of repelling mounted Indians, the most expert horsemen in the world, with a force of foot soldiers is ridiculous. So I'm saying the Comanches at this time, they probably could have raided San Antonio, but to spare the civilization's casualties, they made their point another way. The killing of Martha Sherman in 1860 stood out in an especially bloody year. The brutality of her murder by Comanches instilled tremendous fear in Texas settlers. Charles Goodnight gathered a force to hunt down and destroy Peter Nakona and his group. The group of Ranger soldiers and volunteers under the command of Sol Ross, they found Nakona's camp. So Nakona, he could have went to San Antonio, but he's like, let's just kill one captive and maybe they'll understand that we mean business. But instead they go after his camp. Cynthia Ann cried as they killed her husband. It was this whole big scene, but they bring Cynthia Ann back to San Antonio. She could not write, she could not speak English, or she chose not to. Her uncle had to lock her in her house when he left, otherwise she would run off. Every day is a celebration, not on this side. Luckily, Cynthia Ann, her sons were still alive. Quanah and his brother Peanuts were 12 and 10 years old. So that's where we started the story with Quanah, 1871. He's a half-blood, but he rises up to be the best Indian. They escaped and even thought that they were young, Quanah and Peanut. At a 12-year-old, a Comanche was still very tough and competent at survival, which Quanah and the eldest displayed by tracking down the rest of the tribe while evading Goodnight and his troops. Quanah learned early on to hunt, ride, and became an adept archer. When he reached puberty, he went on a vision quest. The bear spirit became his puha. Let's go. So he wasn't even being accepted back into the clans because he's a half-blood, but that doesn't matter. He still goes out to terrorize the white man. Nevertheless, Quanah became a full-fledged warrior at age 15. He was taller and stronger than the average Comanche, who was a short people. When he became an adult, Quanah was 6 feet tall. In 1868, he took part in a raid into Mexico. It wasn't as easy or successful as previous raids had been. If Quanah hadn't been so young and carefree and enthusiastic about his life, he might have noticed that time was running out for the Comanches, but this would not be in his thoughts until much later. So after that raid, Quanah's like, I don't need to be part of a little tribe anymore. He takes some 20 men, and they go out and raid several hundred horses. So he effectively starts his own tribe. One of the greatest raids led by the Comanche during the war years became to be known as Elm Creek Raid, which occurred in 1864. In response to the raid, Brigadier General James H. Carleton sent to the storied Christopher Kit Carson on a punitive campaign deep into the heart of Comancheria, the Llano Escantado, something few had ever attempted before and where no one had ever succeeded. Carson and his troops carried a decisive weapon with them. He carried mountain howitzers all the way to the battle. The howitzers were small cannons that were loaded with canister shot, which meant they were basically giant shotguns. During an encounter with the Comanches, Colonel Carlson made a tactical mistake, but the cannons were used to such an effect that the mistake was not fatal. So just like Custer's last stand, the Comanches were able to hunt down all of Custer's foot soldiers, but this guy, he had the mountain howitzers, and his men were able to get away, because they just kept blasting them with gigantic shotguns. Other punitive attacks were launched against the Indians in 1864. The one led by J.H. Chivington resulted in a terrible slaughter against the Cheyenne. It became known as the Sand Creek Massacre, and it was met with condemnation by people in the eastern U.S. So they're starting to use real technology on the Indians, and even people on the East Coast are like, this is too much. 1867, the Kansas Treaty. This was the last hope for peace. During the proceedings, both sides condemned the other for breaking treaties. In a speech given by a Comanche chief called Ten Bears, he blatantly and directly stated that the Indians were not to blame for the war of violence, that the white man had invaded their lands and killed their buffalo. General Tecumseh Sherman was president, and he was just as direct. The Indians were given an ultimatum: abide by the Treaty of Kansas or be destroyed. The treaty required them to move on to reservations, but stipulated that the U.S. government would support them and give them what they needed. The treaty was signed by most chiefs October 21st, 1867. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. government failed due to corruption in the Office of Indian Affairs to provide the Indians with the promised provisions. In 1868, the agent J.H. Leavenworth quit his job in disgust with the negligence. Many Comanches and other left the reservation to hunt and raid in order to provide what the government was lacking to give them. Chapter 4, Indian Giver. Final chapter. Who's the real Indian giver here? We signed a treaty guaranteeing land and support, and we never gave them the support. And of course the Indians are Indian givers because they said, hey, come live on this land with us. And then we hunted the buffalo to death, and they're like, nah, give us our land back. We didn't know you were going to treat it like that. I think everyone's an Indian giver. Not taking sides. But we're back to the beginning now. Randall Mackenzie, October 2nd, 1871. Randall was a West Point graduate. He went to school with Custer. In the Civil War, 2 of his fingers got blown off, which give him the nickname Bad Hand. Randall Mackenzie Bad Hand. It's pretty sick. After the war, Grant appointed him to the 4th Cavalry of Texas. And Grant knew that the treaties were worthless because the Office of Indian Affairs was so corrupt. The Indians quickly learned that the treaties were worthless, and that if they wanted to get goods, the best way of doing so was to raid and kill, because inevitably the government would come to them with gifts to get them to stop raiding. Many residents of the frontier thought that 1872 was the worst year for Indian raids. In 1870, a new tanning method allowed the buffalo hides to be turned into high-grade leather. Thus began the true mass slaughter of the buffalo herds. A hunter named Tom Nixon once shot 120 animals in 40 minutes. In 1873, he killed 3,200 buffaloes in 35 days. As the buffalo herds progressively disappeared and the Indians grew desperate, a Comanche named Isatai had a powerful vision. Isatai was a young medicine man and claimed to possess superhuman powers like raising people from the dead. In his vision, Isatai claimed that he was taken up to the clouds and spoken with the Great Spirit, who gave him the power to destroy the white man and destroy Comanche prowess. Quanah believed in Isaitai's vision. Isatai called all the Comanche together for a sun dance to prepare for war, something that had never been done before. Imagine hearing a war cry off in the distance. I'd pack up and leave. The first attack was against a buffalo hunting camp. It did not go so well. The hunters had been informed of a pending attack and thus were not taken by surprise. The Comanche could not burn down the building housing because the hunters covered it in damp sod. The hunters also possessed powerful long-range rifles. They were all cracking shots and had plenty of ammunition and stores of supplies. The Comanche were quickly repulsed and discovered that they had to retreat far away because the hunters could snipe them from a great distance. One Indian was shot from almost a mile away. That was the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. It was a complete failure for the Indians. In 1874, all reservations were placed under military control. President Grant made the government's goal clear. The army was to hunt them all down and bring them under control of the reservations. There would be no more peace until this was accomplished. The Comanche numbers in 1874 were at their lowest, roughly 3,000. In August and September, the army prepared for a final campaign to destroy them or bring them to the reservations. It was the largest force ever sent against the Indians because it wasn't only the Comanches, but the Plain Indians who the army was also after. That other guy killed 3,000 buffaloes in 30 days. Shouldn't be a fight. Well, Mackenzie, old Bad Hand, he's about to fight the biggest battle ever known, the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. The Comanches and their allies were under the command of a powerful war chief, Lone Wolf. Mackenzie and his troops, using Tonkawa scouts, tracked the Indians over many miles. The Comanches attacked at night, but Mackenzie had commanded his men to secure horses so that the Comanches couldn't drive them off or steal them. The Comanche attack was repulsed, with only one casualty on the U.S. side. In the morning, Mackenzie moved his troops in a strategic feint. His goal was the main camp, but he made it look like he was going in a different direction. The 4th Cavalry was then able to come upon the Indian camps unaware. The surprised Indians fled, the U.S. troops burned the camp, and the back of the Comanche resistance was broken. The Indians, Cowaoa, Arapaho, Comanche, all taking a stand together, slowly came to the reservations over the winter months and early spring to surrender. By April 1875, Quanah and his men had not yet turned themselves in. Damn. So basically everybody's round up by 1875. Quanah eventually turns himself into the reservation. He wants to try to lead his people from the inside. The Comanches quickly learned how degrading life was on the reservation. They were like small children having to get everything they needed and handed to them by the U.S. government. They could no longer hunt and care for themselves. To make things worse, they rarely received what they needed. Get your hunting tags. In 1877, a small band of Comanches left the reservation. The U.S. authorities asked Quanah to bring them back. It is a testament to not only how much Quanah had changed, fully surrendering his hatred and adaptation to white ways, but also how much Comanches respected him. In 1880, Quanah was able to convince the authorities to allow his people to go on a buffalo hunt for old time's sake. When they reached the plains in their old lands, the Comanche were not able to find a single buffalo. I went to Devil's Tower this winter. There's a gigantic pit a few miles east where they used to do buffalo jumps. Bro. You can see why the buffalo doesn't exist anymore. Every single inch of Wyoming and South Dakota, it's fenced off now. Bro, this is the reservation, but I'm not here to make political statements. Quanah himself went into the cattle business, seeing it as a good way to help supply his people with what they needed. Ranchers around the reservation allowed the cattle to graze on reservation lands, which was illegal. Quanah, however, made a deal with the ranchers legally with the government allowance to tax the ranchers according to each head of cattle. Dang. Life went from a daily celebration to a daily negotiation. The Indians, welcome to the Leviathan. We're happy to have you. And yeah, this is the story of history that we're told, but it's a reoccurring theme. The Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, 1,200 pages, read it. Once the white man got them off the reservation, or on the reservation, it was basically over. They signed the Dawes Act of 1887. This is like an underhanded way to get the Indian lands for cheap. So we slowly shrink their lands, feed them alcohol and gambling. The battle's over. On 29th of December, 1882, Bad Hand Mackenzie was checked into an asylum in New York. He died July 18th, 1889, at the age of 48, thus marking a symbolic end to the Comanche Empire. There you guys have it. Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn. The story of history. Empires and guerrilla warfare. This was a good one. Leave a thumbs up if you guys like the story. Some history for yous. Not my forte, but if you like it, we'll go deeper. Harry Shit on Instagram if you want some free memes. Thank you guys for tuning in for another edition. Let's keep lifting those brain weights every Tuesday morning. Nick Muniz signing off. Peace!